The morning sunlight streamed into the cafe, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Barron Trump sat by the window, a quiet figure of poise and maturity, his gaze drifting occasionally to the bustling street outside. He sipped his coffee absent-mindedly, his thoughts seemingly far away, until something unusual caught his eye. A woman trudged past the cafe, her movements slow and heavy, as though the weight of the world rested on her frail shoulders. Her coat, once vibrant, was now faded and threadbare, barely protecting her from the biting cold. Her hair, streaked with gray, hung limply around her face, which bore the unmistakable marks of hardship. Barron's gaze lingered on her longer than he expected, something in her figure tugging at a distant memory. She stopped just outside the cafe, her eyes scanning the sidewalk, perhaps for something or someone. For a moment, she looked up, and their eyes nearly met through the glass. Barron froze. There was something hauntingly familiar about her face, though he couldn't place it. The woman hesitated before stepping inside, the cafe's warmth swallowing her as she entered. She kept her head low, her posture timid, as though she was intruding. She approached the counter, her voice barely audible as she asked for water. The barista handed her a cup, his expression hesitant as he glanced toward the manager. Barron's heart began to pound as he watched her from his table. The way she moved, the tilt of her head, it stirred something deep within him, a memory buried beneath years of distance and change. His hands tightened around his coffee cup, and he felt an inexplicable urge to approach her. The woman turned slightly, the cafe's light catching her face. That's when it hit him like a sudden crash of waves. His breath caught in his throat as the fragments of memory pieced themselves together. It was her. He rose from his seat, his tall frame drawing attention as he crossed the room. His voice, steady yet filled with urgency, broke the silence. "Maria?" She turned toward him, her face a mask of disbelief. Her hands trembled as she brought them to her mouth, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. "Senor Barron?" she whispered, her voice fragile and cracked. In that moment, the bustling cafe seemed to fade away. Time stood still as recognition dawned on both of them, the weight of the past crashing into the present. Barron stood frozen for a moment, his usually composed expression betraying a mixture of shock and confusion. "Maria, is it really you?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost disbelieving. The woman nodded slowly, her trembling hands still covering her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill as she tried to form words. "Yes, Senor Barron," she managed to say, her voice breaking. "It's me." Memories rushed back to him like a flood, her warm smile as she read him bedtime stories, the way she comforted him when his parents were away, and the songs she used to sing in Spanish that echoed through the halls of the Trump residence. She had been a constant presence during his childhood, someone he trusted, someone who had always been there. But now, standing before him, she was a shadow of the woman he remembered. Her face, once vibrant and full of life, was etched with lines of hardship. Her clothes hung loosely on her thin frame, and her once proud posture was replaced by a visible weight of despair. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if afraid of being overheard. "It's a long story," she said, looking down at the floor. "I shouldn't be here. I didn't mean to disturb you." Barron shook his head, his tone firm yet kind. "You're not disturbing me, Maria. Please sit down." She hesitated, but eventually nodded, taking a seat across from him. The cafe buzzed around them, but neither paid any attention. Barron leaned forward, his intense gaze searching her face. "Tell me everything. How did this happen?" Maria took a deep breath, her hands clutching the cup of water tightly as if it were her lifeline. After I left your family, things fell apart," she began, her voice wavering. "I didn't want to leave, Barron. You have to believe me." Barron frowned, leaning closer. "Leave? I thought you wanted to go back to Mexico. That's what they told me." Maria shook her head vehemently, her tears finally spilling over. No, that's not true. It was all a misunderstanding. Something happened. Someone accused me of taking something from the house, something I didn't take. I tried to explain, but they didn't believe me. Barron's stomach turned, a wave of guilt and anger washing over him. You mean they fired you over a false accusation? She nodded, her voice trembling. I had nowhere to go. I couldn't afford a lawyer, and my visa was tied to my job. I ended up losing everything. Barron sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. How had this happened? How had someone who had been such a vital part of his life been cast aside so easily, her life unraveling as a result? And why hadn't he known? He was just a boy then, but now as a young man, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. I didn't know, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Maria, I'm so sorry. I should have asked questions. Maria gave him a weak smile, her eyes filled with a sorrowful kindness. You were a child, Barron. There was nothing you could have done. Barron clenched his fists under the table, his jaw tightening. Maybe then, but not now. Barron's mind raced as Maria's words sank deeper. He couldn't shake the image of her being thrown out, her life unraveling over something she hadn't done. The guilt was suffocating, but beneath it burned a determination to make things right. He leaned forward, his voice firm. Maria, this ends now. I'm going to help you. She shook her head, her eyes wide with panic. No, Barron. You don't need to. I do, he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. You were there for me when I needed you most. Now it's my turn. Maria opened her mouth to protest but stopped. Her eyes searched his, and for the first time in years, she saw the same boy she had cared for, a boy who had grown into a man but hadn't lost his heart. Barron stood, pulling out his phone. Wait here, he said firmly before stepping outside. He paced the sidewalk as he made a series of calls. His voice was low but commanding, his words precise. Maria, still sitting at the table, watched him through the cafe window, her hands trembling around the glass of water. She couldn't believe this was happening. When Barron returned, his face was calm, but his resolve was clear. First, we're going to get you somewhere warm, he said. A hotel for tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. Maria stared at him, overwhelmed. Barron, I can't. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, he replied gently. Just let me help. That evening, Barron escorted Maria to a nearby hotel, insisting on covering everything. She sat on the edge of the bed, the warmth of the room a stark contrast to the years she had spent on the streets. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. As Barron prepared to leave, she called out softly, Why are you doing this, Barron? He turned, his expression softer now. Because you didn't deserve what happened to you, and because I should have known sooner. I'm going to fix this, Maria. The next day, Barron wasted no time. He contacted lawyers, spoke with organizations, and dug into the details of Maria's dismissal. What he discovered only fueled his anger. The accusation that had cost Maria everything was baseless, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by a staff member who hadn't liked her. Barron's name opened doors, and within hours he had secured a meeting with his parents' former staff manager. Barron met the manager in a sleek office building. The man, visibly uncomfortable, shifted under Barron's intense gaze. I don't care about excuses, Barron said sharply. I want this fixed. You ruined someone's life over nothing, and you're going to make it right. The manager stammered, promising to cooperate, but Barron was already thinking beyond reparations. He wanted justice, not just for Maria, but for anyone who might have suffered similarly. Meanwhile, Maria began to rebuild. With Barron's support, she was able to secure temporary housing and start addressing the trauma she had carried for so long. The two reconnected over shared memories, and Maria's laughter, though hesitant at first, slowly returned. She began to feel like herself again. Barron wasn't finished, though. He wanted to ensure Maria's story was heard, not to shame anyone, but to highlight the systemic failures that had led to her suffering. He coordinated with advocates and journalists, sharing her story with Maria's blessing. The public response was overwhelming, with people rallying behind her and calling for accountability. Under Barron's guidance, Maria began taking steps she had once thought impossible. With a new wardrobe and a place to call home, she started to regain a sense of dignity. But while her life was improving, the scars of her past couldn't be erased so easily. Barron, ever perceptive, noticed her hesitation when talking about her future. One afternoon, over coffee in a quiet cafe, he asked, "Maria, have you thought about what you want to do next?" She looked down at her hands, her voice barely audible. "I don't know. I used to dream of being a teacher before everything fell apart, but now I'm not sure I could." Barron leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "Why not? You've always been great with kids. You were like a teacher to me when I was little." Maria gave a sad smile. "That was a long time ago. I wouldn't even know where to start." "You start by believing it's possible," Barron said, his determination unwavering. "And I'll help you with the rest." True to his word, Barron began making calls, connecting Maria with organizations that help displaced workers rebuild their careers. He found programs that offered certifications for teaching assistants and pledged to cover the costs. Maria resisted at first, her pride making it difficult to accept so much help. But Barron's sincerity finally broke through her reservations. Meanwhile, Barron faced his own set of challenges. The story of his involvement with Maria had started to circulate, and while many praised his actions, others questioned his motives. Tabloid headlines like "Barron Trump saves homeless Nanny P. are stunt or genuine gesture" began to appear, drawing both admiration and scrutiny. Barron ignored the noise. To him, the opinions of strangers didn't matter. What mattered was Maria's future. However, the growing attention put pressure on Maria, who struggled with the idea of becoming a public figure. One evening, she confided in Barron, her voice heavy with worry. "I don't want people to see me as a victim," she said. "I don't want to be a symbol." "You're not a victim," Barron replied firmly. "You're a survivor. And if sharing your story can help others, then maybe it's worth it." Maria considered his words, and after much deliberation, she agreed to do an interview with a reputable journalist Barron trusted. The resulting article was a powerful account of her journey, shedding light on the struggles faced by many in her position. It wasn't just her story, it was a call for change. The interview sparked widespread discussions, with many calling for reforms in worker protections and immigration policies. Maria began receiving letters of support from people who had faced similar hardships, and she found herself stepping into a role she had never anticipated: an advocate. As Maria's confidence grew, so did her determination. She completed her certification program with flying colors and began working as a teaching assistant at a local school. The joy she felt being surrounded by children again was palpable, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was where she belonged. Barron continued to support her, but as Maria began to thrive, she insisted on standing on her own. "You've done enough, Barron," she told him one day, her smile warm. "It's time for me to take it from here." He nodded, though a part of him felt a pang of sadness. "I'll always be here if you need me," he said. Maria placed a hand on his arm, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I know, and I'll never forget what you've done for me." As Maria's life steadily improved, Barron watched her transformation with quiet pride. She had gone from a shadow of herself to a confident, determined woman with a clear purpose. But the road to recovery was far from smooth. The increased public attention brought challenges neither of them had anticipated. One afternoon, Maria called Barron in tears. Her voice trembled as she explained, "Barron, someone posted lies about me online. They're saying I deserve what happened, that I stole." Barron's jaw tightened as he listened. Who would do something like that? Maria hesitated before replying. It's Jessica, the housekeeper who accused me all those years ago. She's saying terrible things, Barron. People are starting to believe her. The name hit Barron like a slap. He remembered Jessica, an abrasive and sometimes bitter woman, who had always seemed to resent Maria's close relationship with him as a child. It was Jessica's accusation that had led to Maria's dismissal all those years ago. Don't worry, Barron said firmly. I'll handle this. Barron immediately reached out to his legal team and PR advisors, determined to clear Maria's name. They dug into Jessica's claims, uncovering inconsistencies and contradictions that painted a damning picture of her motives. Meanwhile, Barron decided to take a more personal approach. He requested a private meeting with Jessica, determined to confront her face to face. The meeting took place in a quiet office, away from prying eyes. Jessica entered with a defensive posture, her expression hard. I don't know what you think you're doing, Barron, she said sharply, but I'm not afraid of you. Barron didn't flinch. I'm not here to threaten you, he replied, his tone steady. I'm here to ask why. Why did you lie about Maria? Why are you trying to ruin her life again? Jessica's facade cracked for a moment, a flicker of guilt crossing her face, but she quickly masked it with indignation. She always thought she was better than the rest of us. I just wanted her to know her place. Barron's eyes narrowed, his voice cold. Her place? Her place was in our home, caring for me like no one else could. And you destroyed that because of your own insecurities. Jessica looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she muttered. But it did, Barron shot back. And now you're going to fix it. Over the next week, Jessica publicly retracted her statements, admitting that her original accusations against Maria were false. The revelation sent shockwaves through the media, vindicating Maria and restoring her reputation. The public rallied behind her once more, and donations poured in for organizations supporting workers who had faced similar injustices. Maria, though grateful, struggled with the emotional toll of reliving her past. Barron stayed by her side, his unwavering support giving her the strength to keep moving forward. One evening, as they sat together in her modest apartment, Maria looked at him with tears in her eyes. You didn't have to do all this for me, Barron, she said softly, but you did. And I'll never forget it. Barron smiled, his usual composure softening. You were there for me when I needed you, Maria. I'm just returning the favor. Just as the dust seemed to settle, another unexpected challenge arose. One evening, Maria received an email that left her trembling. It was from Jessica, the former housekeeper. The message was not an apology but a veiled threat. Jessica hinted that she had more stories to tell about Maria, warning that her public image could be tarnished again if Maria didn't back away from her newfound advocacy work. Maria immediately called Barron, her voice shaking as she recounted the email. I thought it was over, Barron. Why is she doing this? Barron listened quietly, his calm presence grounding her. Because she's desperate, he said. And people like that only have power if you let them. But don't worry, we're going to end this for good. The next morning, Barron's legal team went to work. They filed a formal complaint against Jessica for defamation and harassment. At the same time, Barron used his connections to ensure Maria's story gained even more attention. Major outlets picked up the narrative, emphasizing Maria's strength and resilience. Public opinion turned decisively in her favor, with countless people expressing outrage at Jessica's behavior. Jessica's attempts to strike back only made things worse for her. As her lies unraveled under scrutiny, she faced mounting pressure to retreat. Eventually, she issued a formal apology, though it was clear it came out of self-preservation rather than genuine remorse. Maria, though exhausted, refused to let Jessica's actions derail her progress. Instead, she channeled her energy into her advocacy work, speaking at events and sharing her story with organizations focused on worker rights. Each time she stood in front of an audience, she felt her confidence grow. Barron remained her steadfast supporter, though he often stayed in the background, allowing Maria to shine. One evening, after a particularly moving event where Maria had been the keynote speaker, she turned to Barron, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've done so much for me," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Barron shook his head, his expression kind but firm. "You've already repaid me, Maria. Watching you stand up there tonight, knowing how far you've come, that's more than enough." Months later, Maria's life had transformed completely. She was now working full-time as a teaching assistant and had begun training to become a licensed teacher. Her advocacy work had also gained recognition, earning her invitations to speak at conferences across the country. For the first time in years, Maria felt a sense of purpose and belonging. Barron, though busy with his own life, made it a point to stay in touch. One day, he visited Maria's classroom, watching from the back as she guided a group of young children through a reading exercise. The joy on her face was unmistakable, and for Barron, it was a moment of pure pride. As the students filed out for recess, Maria approached him, smiling. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think you've found your place," Barron replied, "and I couldn't be prouder." As Maria's life continued to flourish, an unexpected opportunity arose. A major nonprofit organization advocating for worker rights and immigrant protections reached out to her, impressed by her story and her growing public presence. They invited her to join as a spokesperson, offering her the chance to bring real change to people facing the struggles she had endured. Maria hesitated. She was deeply passionate about teaching and had finally found stability in her new life. The idea of stepping back into the spotlight, with all the attention and scrutiny it might bring, filled her with doubt. She called Barron to share the news, seeking his guidance. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted. "What if I fail? What if it's too much?" Barron listened quietly, as he always did, before responding. "Maria, you've already faced the worst and come out stronger. This isn't about being perfect. It's about using your voice to make a difference. If this is something you feel called to do, you shouldn't let fear hold you back." His words stayed with her, and after days of careful thought, she decided to accept the role. Her first major appearance as the organization's spokesperson was scheduled for a televised panel discussion on worker rights, alongside prominent advocates and policymakers. It was the kind of stage she'd never imagined for herself, and the nerves hit hard as the day approached. Barron, knowing how much this moment meant, made time to be there in person. Sitting in the audience, he watched as Maria took her seat on the panel, her composure betraying none of the anxiety she had shared with him earlier. When it was her turn to speak, she told her story with grace and authenticity, weaving her personal experiences into a larger call for systemic change. The audience hung on her every word, and by the end of the discussion, the applause was thunderous. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Barron approached Maria, his face lit with pride. "You were incredible," he said. "I knew you would be." Maria smiled, the weight of her earlier fears lifting. "I couldn't have done it without you, Barron. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." "And look where it got you," he replied. "This is just the beginning." Months passed, and Maria's role as a spokesperson flourished alongside her work as a teaching assistant. She had become a beacon of hope for many, her story resonating with those who had faced similar hardships. Through her advocacy, she helped secure funding for shelters, legal aid, and job training programs, making a tangible difference in the lives of others. One sunny afternoon, Maria stood in the courtyard of the school where she now worked full-time as a teacher. She watched as her students played, their laughter filling the air. It was a far cry from the uncertainty and despair she had felt not long ago. For the first time in years, she felt a deep sense of peace. Barron visited her occasionally, his presence always a reminder of the pivotal moment that had set her life on this new path. On one such visit, as they walked through the park near the school, Maria turned to him with a smile. "I owe so much of this to you," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You didn't just help me, you gave me my life back." Barron shook his head, his expression warm. "Maria, you did the hard part. You took that chance and turned it into something incredible. I just gave you a nudge." They sat on a bench, the autumn leaves rustling around them. Barron looked thoughtful for a moment before speaking again. "You know, I think about what happened back then, the misunderstanding, the way things were handled. It wasn't fair, and I can't change the past, but I've learned something important from it." Maria tilted her head, curious. "What's that?" Barron smiled faintly. "That sometimes life gives us a second chance to do the right thing, and when it does, we have to take it." Maria reached over and squeezed his hand. "You did more than take it, Barron. You changed my life. And because of that, I get to help change others." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the leaves fall, each lost in their thoughts. For Barron, it was a moment of quiet reflection on the power of small choices and the ripple effects they could have. For Maria, it was a reminder that no matter how dark life might seem, there was always a chance for light to break through. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they rose from the bench and said their goodbyes. Barron watched Maria walk back toward the school, her head held high and her stride confident. She was no longer the woman he had seen in that cafe months ago. She was strong, capable, and unstoppable. Barron smiled to himself as he turned to leave, the crisp autumn air invigorating him. He didn't need thanks or recognition. Knowing Maria was thriving was enough. Sometimes, being a part of someone else's journey was its own reward. And with that, Barron walked away, leaving behind not just a story of redemption, but a legacy of hope and second chances. This story reminds us all of the power of compassion, second chances, and standing up for what's right. If you found this story inspiring, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button now to join a community where powerful stories like this come to life. Like this video, share it with your friends, and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment that could move or inspire you. Together, let's keep these stories alive.